I felt myself starting to smile. Skill with machines runs in my family, you see. Really, he said. I don't remember your father being much good with moving parts. His eyes lowered. He was a good man, don't misunderstand me. A real good man. This touched me so deeply that I wasn't even tempted to explain. Besides, there was a reason Mother had kept her inventions anonymous. Few people thought a woman capable of mechanical brilliance like hers. I could hardly expect Mr. Waters to believe that my mother, not my father, had been the expert mechanic. Thank you, I whispered. Well, he said briskly, handing me the part, you can't do more harm to it at least, and I'll thank you for trying. Turning the long, ridged bit of metal over in my fingers, I took a deep breath and sent my mother a silent prayer to help me prove myself in this. So the heroine goes on from there to fix the sewing machine, and she realizes that she can create her own sewing machines and knitting machines to fund the inventions that she wants to create to go to the exposition. And so it was important to me to have both a ball and a technical exposition there so that she's not just going with a sort of romantic goal, but with a professional and creative goal as well. And there is a prince in the story and there is romance in the story. But for me, the real hero's journey that my Cinderella goes on is of sort of empowering herself, improving herself as an inventor, and gaining independence from her abusive family. And the happy ending that she ends up with probably has more to do with that. And there's a sequel to Mechanica that deals with the embargo on fairy. There's a sort of magical land called Fairy where they used to import magic from, and it deals a lot more with that. But for this story, I wanted the fairy tale, the magic, to come from what Nicolette creates, and so that was. It was only natural to me that was connected to textile arts, because Cinderella is in a fundamental way, at least the Western versions that we know, is a story about a dress and a story about an outfit. And that might be something like many textile arts, or like many feminine handicrafts, as they're called, that's sort of dismissed or minimized or denigrated. But I wanted this idea of her being a mechanic and inventor not to mean that she rejects traditionally feminine things. And so, you know, I love feminine aesthetics and I love the feminine in general, and I wanted to keep that in this story. And so I wanted Nicolette to still value all those things that are part of the appeal of Cinderella for so many people in the first place. And so she makes her own clothes, she makes her own shoes and her carriage, and it ends up being her little mechanical animals that make the dress for her, which is sort of a nod to the Disney film. But it was important to me that textile craft be an intrinsic part of how my inventor Cinderella finds her empowerment. And also, even, you know, that I talk about the invitation to the ball being on paper that feels like cloth. And I was thinking about Cinderella as a perfectly oiled machine, but you can also see it as a perfectly woven piece of fabric. And those, the mechanical being so traditionally masculine and the textile being so traditionally feminine, I wanted to bring those together as well. And so my Cinderella uses both to reach her happy ending. And the idea of textiles and fairy tales are so intrinsic. There's a related tale to Cinderella called Thousand Furs or Donkey Skin, in which the heroine tries to prevent the villain from marrying her by making impossible requests that have to do with fabric. She asks for a dress as bright as the sun, a dress that glows like the moon, or in some variants, she asks for a cloak made out of 1,000 different furs. And the hope is that this will be an impossible task to fulfill and the villain will never be able to marry her. It's a wonderful, very dark tale, but that is closely related in fairy tale scholarship to Cinderella. And one of my favorite iterations of it is Robin McKinley's beautiful novel, Deerskin, which I reread at least once a year and always find fascinating and cathartic to read. And so I think the idea of dress, of textile and fairy tales is so much part of the way those stories are told. And the idea of a fairy tale as a feminine form, as a story told by old women or by mothers at the hearthside, I think is part of that too. And the idea of women's writing or writing for women being somehow smaller or less less interesting or less important than male literature or literature that focuses on men is part of what drew me to it in the first place, and is part of what drew me to writing for young people. I found a kind of freedom in writing stories in genres that would be dismissed by certain people in the first place, because I found that then I wouldn't have to sort of spend all my time trying to prove myself to the literary canon. And I take my writing just as seriously now as I did when I was trying to write sort of highbrow literary stories for adults, but now I write for children, and I tend to center women and girls and the feminine experience in my stories. But that doesn't mean that I take it even a whit less seriously than I would if I were writing in any other genre. And to me, that's part of the appeal of textile art as well, especially those people called fine artists whose work might be displayed in museums now or might be getting serious interest from art critics. Thankfully, we get more textile artists in the last few decades who are receiving serious interest from the art world. But the idea that it is a traditionally feminine form, a form that has been minimized in the past, is I think something that textile artists work with in a really intelligent and self-aware way that really resonates with me, for the reasons why I wanted to work with fairy tales, to work with this form that is both just omnipresent in our daily lives. There's nothing more constantly present in our homes and our lives than fabric, than textiles. And then fairy tales and folk tales and the stories that get told over and over again, even to children, even so commonly that we don't even realize they're there sometimes. These things, it's this sort of, it ties into ideas of invisible labor and the mental load of women and mothers, which is something I think about now as a single mother as well, of course. There are these things that are so crucial that they become invisible. And that's what fascinates me about both textiles and fairy tales. And that's where I see the commonality between them, and to sort of draw them out into the light and say, no, this is worth looking at and taking seriously is really important to me.